Empires often appear permanent. From the outside, they seem unshakable, too large to fail, too powerful to fall. History tells a different story. Sometimes an empire survives the death of its founder, sometimes it dies with him. In the summer of 336 BC, nobody knew which fate awaited Macedonia. Philip had not simply ruled the kingdom, he had transformed it. He had rebuilt its army, reformed its government, expanded its borders, and united Greece beneath Macedonian leadership. For many people, Macedonia and Philip had become honestly inseparable. Without Philip, could the kingdom survive? Across Greece, optimism spread almost immediately. The news traveled quickly. Philip was dead. For the first time in years, cities that had lived beneath Macedonian dominance sensed an opportunity. Athens celebrated. Thebes watched carefully. Old enemies began asking the same question. Was this finally the moment to break free? Even Demosthenes, Philip's fiercest political opponent, reportedly greeted the news with celebration. For years, he had warned that Macedonia threatened the freedom of Greece. Now the man who embodied that threat was gone. From the Greek perspective, the calculation made sense. Philip had been the strategist, the diplomat, the reformer, the architect of Macedonian power. Alexander, he was only 20. Yes, he had fought bravely at Chaeronea. Yes, he had earned the respect of many soldiers. But commanding part of an army was not the same as ruling an empire. The Greeks had seen young kings before. Many inherited greatness, few preserved it. Far to the east, another empire reached a similar conclusion. The Persian Empire had watched Philip's rise with a growing sense of unease and a growing sense of concern. His invasion was no longer a distant possibility. It had already begun. Macedonian forces had crossed into Asia Minor. Bridgeheads had been established. Persian territory was already under attack. To the great king, Philip's assassination must have seemed like an unexpected gift. Perhaps the Greeks would begin fighting one another again. Perhaps Macedonia would descend into civil war. Perhaps the invasion would collapse before it even truly began. It was exactly the outcome Persia had hoped for. Inside Macedonia, however, the danger was even greater. The greatest threats rarely come from beyond the frontier. They come from within. Power attracts ambition. Philip's death had left behind an empty throne. It had left behind unanswered questions, rival claimants, powerful noble families, experienced generals, men who had spent decades serving Philip. And now they had to decide whether they would serve his son. Alexander understood something that many rulers never do. The crown did not make him king. The people did. And if he hesitated, if he appeared uncertain, if he showed even the slightest weakness, everything his father had built could disappear within weeks. Before Alexander could think of Persia, before he could think about glory, before he could think about conquest, he had to survive. The first campaign of his reign would not be fought against a foreign enemy. It would be fought for his own throne. And history would soon discover that Philip's greatest creation was not the Macedonian army. It was the young man who now stood ready to command it. Alexander inherited far more than a crown. He inherited a countdown. Every day he remained uncertain, his enemies became bolder. Every hour spent hesitating gave rivals time to organize, time to recruit allies, time to spread doubts. Alexander could not afford hesitation. He watched Philip rule for 2 decades. He had watched victories won and kingdoms subdued. He had watched his father navigate conspiracies, rebellions, and wars. Now every lesson would be tested. The young king moved with astonishing speed. Before Greece could revolt, before Persia could react, before rival factions inside Macedonia could unite, Alexander secured the one thing every king needed: the army. See, the Macedonian army was unlike any military force in Greece. It was not loyal to a flag, not loyal to a constitution. It was loyal to its king. Philip had earned that loyalty over 20 years. Alexander had to earn it in days. Fortunately, many of the men standing before him already knew the young prince. They had watched him grow, watched him train, watched him ride beside Philip. Some had fought alongside him at Chaeronea. Others had seen him crush the Maedai rebellion while still a teenager. He was young, but he was not unknown. Standing before the assembled Macedonians, Alexander did not ask for their trust. He expected it. There was a confidence in the way he carried himself, confidence that bordered on arrogance. Yet in that moment, confidence was exactly what Macedonia needed. Uncertainty destroys kingdoms. Confidence holds them together. The generals pledged their full support. The companion cavalry remained loyal. The veteran officers accepted him as Philip's successor. The army proclaimed Alexander king. To the outside world, the transition appeared almost effortless. It wasn't. Because while the soldiers accepted Alexander, others saw opportunity. Royal families are complicated. Every marriage creates another branch, every child creates another claimant, every alliance creates another ambition. Philip had spent much of his life marrying for politics. Now, these political marriages produced dangerous consequences. Some believed a different branch of the royal family should rule. Others imagined serving as a regent until another heir came of age. Others simply hoped the confusion might elevate their own position. Alexander understood exactly what that meant. An uncertain succession invites civil war. Civil war destroys empires. He refused to allow either. The young king acted swiftly. Potential rivals were neutralized. Supporters were rewarded. Command structures remained intact. Every important decision sent the same message. There would be no struggle for the throne. There would be one king, Alexander. It was ruthless, but Macedonia had never rewarded hesitation. Philip built his kingdom through decisive action. Alexander intended to preserve it the same way. Yet while order returned inside Macedonia, the rest of Greece reached a very different conclusion. Word of Philip's death spread from city to city, and with every passing day, hope returned. Hope that Macedonian dominance had finally come to an end. Hope that the empire Philip spent 20 years building might collapse before his son truly began to rule. Across Greece, old enemies started making new plans. Alexander had secured his throne. Now he would have to secure his empire. And for the first time, the young king would march south, not as Philip's son, but as the ruler of Macedonia. The news of Philip's death spread with astonishing speed. Philip was dead. Alexander was king. To the people of Macedonia, those two statements belonged together. The rest of Greece, they did not. For nearly 20 years, Philip had been the force holding the Greek world together. Sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through intimidation, often through war. Victories had ended the age of the independent city-states. His army had accomplished what no king before him had managed. He had united Greece. Not everyone accepted that unity willingly. Many accepted it because they had no choice. Now that choice appeared to have returned. Across Greece, old conversations began again. Could Macedonia really survive without Philip? Could a 20-year-old king hold together an empire built by his father? Or had history simply given Greece a second chance? In Athens, celebrations broke out. For years, the orator Demosthenes had warned his fellow Greeks about Philip. Again and again, he argued that Macedonia threatened everything Greece stood for. But now Philip was gone. According to several ancient sources, Demosthenes appeared before the assembly wearing festive clothing, not mourning, celebrating. To him, this wasn't merely the death of a king, it was the possible rebirth of Greek freedom. The feeling spread beyond Athens. Thebes began reconsidering its submission. Cities throughout the Peloponnese quietly reopened old discussions. Even rulers north of Macedonia began watching carefully. Nobody moved immediately. Everyone waited, because one question mattered more than any other. What What kind of king was Alexander? Would he negotiate? Would he hesitate? Would he spend months securing his position? Would he prove weaker than Philip? If he did, rebellion would become inevitable. Alexander understood that before anyone else. He knew something many rulers learned too late. Perception becomes reality. If people believe you are weak, they will test you. If enough people test you at the same time, your kingdom disappears. So Alexander made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He would never allow his enemies to control the pace. He would move first, always. Before Athens could organize, before Thebes could commit, before neighboring kingdoms could form alliances, Alexander gathered the Macedonian army. The same army that had followed Philip across Greece, the same veterans who had shattered the sacred band at Chaeronea, the same disciplined machine his father had spent decades creating. Now they marched behind a new king. Imagine the scene, if you will. A 20-year-old riding at the head of the greatest army the world had seen. Not marching towards Persia, not marching toward glory, marching toward his own subjects. Because before Alexander could conquer the world, he first had to convince Greece that Philip's empire had not died with Philip. The march itself became a message: speed, confidence, resolve. Alexander wasn't reacting to events, he was creating them. Every mile the Macedonian army advanced forced another Greek city to reconsider rebellion. Every report reaching Athens made resistance seem a little more dangerous. Without fighting a major battle, Alexander was already beginning to win. It was a lesson he had learned from Philip. Sometimes the greatest victories are won before swords are ever drawn. Soon representatives from across Greece would gather once more, not to celebrate Philip, not to mourn him, but to decide whether they would accept his son. For Alexander, this would be the first true victory as a king, and he intended to achieve it without giving his enemies the opportunity they had been waiting for. Alexander's understanding was greater than a lot of kings, let alone kings in his age. Power is as much about perception as it is about strength. The moment people believe you're weak, they can test your limits. Alexander refused to let that happen. He would not wait behind the walls of Pella. He would not send letters. He would not negotiate from a distance. Instead, he marched. The Macedonian army assembled with remarkable speed. The veterans who had followed Philip across Greece assembled under the banner of Alexander. Alexander was no longer the prince learning from his father. He was the king replacing him. To many of the soldiers, the transition felt surprisingly natural. They had watched Alexander grow from child into commander. They had seen him govern Macedonia during Philip's absence. They had watched him take charge at Chaeronea. He might have been young, but he had already earned something far more valuable than age: credibility. The march itself became a weapon. Messengers rode ahead of the army. Rumors traveled even faster. Alexander is coming. The Macedonians are already on the move. The new king is marching south. Those reports reached every city in Greece. Athens, Thebes, Thessaly, the smaller states caught between hope and fear. Only days earlier, many had spoken confidently about rebellion. Now these conversations became quieter. Because even though Philip's death had created uncertainty, Alexander's response removed it. The young king wasn't behaving like someone struggling to hold his kingdom together. He behaved like someone preparing to expand it. That confidence mattered. History often remembers Alexander's victories on distant battlefields, yet some of his greatest triumphs came before the battles even had begun. He understood the value of momentum, the value of speed, the value of forcing his enemies to react instead of plan. It was a lesson he learned while watching Philip. Strike before coalitions can form. Move before rumors become armies. Appear where your enemy least expects you. Again and again throughout his career, Alexander would win wars this way. simply through courage, not simply through tactics, through tempo. By making decisions faster than anyone else, the campaign south became the first demonstration of that philosophy. Cities that had begun preparing for revolts suddenly reconsidered. Leaders who had spoken boldly only days before now hesitated. Allies who had hoped for a united Greek uprising would begin wondering if they had misjudged the young king. Alexander had not fought a major battle, yet he was already winning. Because every mile the Macedonian army carried the same message: Philip may be dead, but Macedonia is not, and neither is its ambition. Soon the young king would stand before the leaders of Greece. Some would submit willingly, others reluctantly. A few would wait for another opportunity, but all of them were beginning to understand the uncomfortable truth. The age of Philip was over. The age of Alexander had just begun. For the people of Greece, Alexander faced an impossible challenge. No matter what he did, he would be compared to Philip. Every decision, speech, march, victory. His father had spent more than 20 years building a reputation. Alexander had inherited overnight. Most rulers spend years proving themselves. Alexander had days. And yet something unexpected began to occur. The young king was not trying to imitate Philip. Yes, he might have used the same army, the same generals, the same political system, but he had a different energy about him. Philip had been patient, calculating, prepared to spend years achieving a single objective. Alexander possessed those qualities, but he possessed something else as well: urgency. He moved faster, decided faster, marched faster. It was as though he believed time itself was an enemy. Perhaps it was. He had grown up watching Philip seize opportunity after opportunity. He understood that hesitation gave your enemies time to recover. Momentum once lost was difficult to regain. So Alexander refused to slow down. As the Macedonian army advanced through Greece, city after city facing the same choice: resist or recognize the new king, many chose recognition. Not because they loved Macedonia, not because they admired Alexander, because they understood the alternative. They remembered Chaeronea, they remembered Philip's victories, and now they saw that the army which had defeated them still stood united. Only its commander had changed. The transition happened so quickly that many Greek leaders scarcely had time to react. One by one, delegations arrived. Oaths were renewed, agreements reaffirmed. The League of Corinth, the alliance Philip had created to unite Greece against Persia, remained intact. For Alexander, this was more than diplomatic success. It was legitimacy. The young king was no longer merely accepted by the Macedonians. He was being recognized by the wider Greek world as Philip's successor. That recognition mattered, because Alexander had no intention of abandoning his father's greatest ambition. The invasion of Persia would continue. The army would march east. The campaign Philip had begun would become Alexander's. Everything appeared to be falling back into place. The empire had survived the death of its founder. The Greek alliance remained intact. The Macedonian army stood ready. To many observers, the crisis seemed over. It wasn't. Not everyone in Greece was willing to accept the new king. Some cities had submitted out of fear rather than loyalty. Others waited patiently for another opportunity. And far to the south, one city was about to make a decision that would change Alexander's reign forever: Thebes. The city that had once challenged Sparta, the city whose sacred band had fallen at Chaeronea, the city that still believed Macedonia could be defeated. Its rebellion would become Alexander's first great test as king, and the ancient world would soon discover just how far the 20-year-old was willing to go to keep his father's empire together. Empires are never truly tested during victory. They are tested in the days that follow. The Greek world that had accepted Alexander, or so it seemed, beneath the surface, resentment still lingered. Old rivalries had not disappeared. Old ambitions had not vanished. They had merely gone quiet. Many city-states had accepted Macedonian rule because Philip stood behind it. Philip was dead. Some Greeks, that changed everything. Rumors began spreading across the Aegean. Alexander was too young. The Macedonian court was divided. The army would soon fall apart. The empire Philip had built would collapse under its own weight. That hope that returned to Greece, it wasn't a hope of conquest, but a hope of freedom. And among those watching closely was Thebes. Only 2 years earlier, the city had suffered one of the greatest defeats in its history at Chaeronea. Its famous sacred band had been destroyed, its political influence shattered. Yet the spirit of Thebes had not been broken. The city had risen before, and it believed it could rise again. Then another rumor arrived. Alexander was dead, or so people claimed. Reports filtered south that the young king had been killed while campaigning in the north against rebellious tribes. No one could verify this story. No one even knew whether it was true. But sometimes rumors are more powerful than facts. Thebes chose to believe them. The city expelled the Macedonian garrison, called its citizens to arms, sent messages throughout Greece. The message was simple. Macedonia was leaderless. Now was the time to rise. Athens listened. Other cities hesitated. Some quietly waited to see what would happen next. Everything depended on one question. Was Alexander really dead? The answer came faster than anyone expected. Alexander wasn't dead. He was marching. The moment news of the Theban revolt reached him, he made the same decision that would define his entire career. He refused to wait. Most kings would have spent weeks gathering supplies, consulting advisors, summoning reinforcements, preparing a campaign. Alexander did none of those things. He marched immediately, across mountains, across difficult terrain, driving his army south at extraordinary speed. The pace stunned everyone. Day after day, the Macedonians pushed forward, covering distances many believed impossible for an army of that size. It was Alexander's greatest weapon. Not his sword, not his cavalry, speed. He understood that surprise could defeat an enemy before the battle had even begun. The Thebans expected weeks, Alexander gave them days. Before Greece fully understood what was happening, the Macedonian army appeared outside the walls of Thebes. Disbelief spread through the city. The rumors had been wrong. The king lived, and he had arrived far sooner than anyone had imagined. Alexander still offered the city a chance. Surrender. Hand over those responsible for the revolts. Rejoin the League of Corinth. The city refused. The decision would become one of the most consequential in Greek history, because Alexander had inherited more than Philip's throne. He had inherited Philip's empire. And if that empire fractured in his very first year as king, everything his father had built would disappear. Alexander knew he could not allow this to happen. What happened next would send a message across the ancient world, a message so powerful that even Persia would hear it. The young king had come to Thebes with a choice. A city had made its own. Now, history would remember the consequences. Alexander stood before the walls of Thebes. This was the first truly defining decision of his reign. He could show mercy, he could negotiate, he could even forgive, or he could make an example. History rarely offers perfect choices, only consequences. For Alexander, the calculation was brutally simple. If Thebes succeeded, Athens might rebel. Sparta might rebel. The League of Corinth would collapse. Persia would watch Greece descend into civil war. Everything Philip had spent 20 years building would disappear. One city stood between Macedonia and chaos. The siege began. The Thebans fought with remarkable courage. They knew what defeat would mean. They knew surrender offered no guarantees. So they resisted, street by street, wall by wall. And for a time, they held. Then the Macedonians found an opening. The breach spread. The defensive line collapsed. The battle moved inside the city. Ancient warfare was unforgiving. Once discipline gave way to panic, events became almost impossible to control. The fighting turned into slaughter. Thousands of Thebans were killed. Thousands more were taken captive. One of the greatest cities in Greece, a city that had once humbled Sparta, a city that had challenged Philip himself, was brought to its knees. Then Alexander made the decision that would echo across the ancient world. Thebes would cease to exist. Its walls were torn down, its homes destroyed, its land divided, its people sold into slavery. Only a handful of places were spared, the temples, and according to tradition, the house of the poet Pindar. Everything else disappeared. To modern eyes, the destruction seems horrifying. To many in the ancient world, it was something else, a warning. Alexander wanted every city in Greece to understand the same message. Philip may be dead, but Macedonia is stronger than ever. The message spread faster than any messenger could ride. Athens abandoned thoughts of rebellion. Other Greek cities reaffirmed their loyalty. The League of Corinth held together. Without fighting another major campaign, Alexander had secured Greece. The cost had been terrible, but from Alexander's perspective, the alternative had been worse. For the rest of his life, the destruction of Thebes would follow him. Some praised it as necessary, others condemned it as excessive. Historians have debated the decision for more than 2,000 years, yet whatever judgment history reaches, one fact remains impossible to ignore. After Thebes, no Greek city seriously challenged Alexander again. The young king had inherited Philip's empire. Now he had proven he could keep it. For the first time since Philip's death, Macedonia stood secure. The throne was no longer in doubt. Greece was no longer in revolt. The army stood united behind its king. Alexander had survived the crisis everyone believed would destroy him. But survival had never been his ambition. Beyond the Aegean Sea lay the Persian Empire, the greatest kingdom on earth, the richest ruler in history, an empire stretching farther than any Greek had ever marched. Philip had dreamed of conquering it. Alexander intended to finish what his father had started. Soon, tens of thousands of Macedonian soldiers would cross into Asia Minor. Some believed they were marching to victory, others believed they were marching to their deaths. None of them could possibly imagine what awaited them, because the next campaign would not simply change Alexander's life, it would change the ancient world forever. And thus began the conquests of the man who'd become known as Alexander the Great.